5 children were packed inside a dead wagon in the middle of a blizzard. No horses, no fire, no adults. The oldest was 13, and she held a knife with someone else's blood still on the blade. A ledger hidden under the floorboards listed their names and prices. The 4-year-old was worth $5. A man on a horse found them that night. A man who had buried his own daughter 6 years ago and swore he would never hold a child again. But when that 13-year-old girl held out her dying sister without saying a word, he took her. And what happened next will wreck you. This is Wild West Stories, where the dust of the frontier carries tales of cowboys who chose courage over comfort, of love born in the harshest places, and of the compassion that proves humanity survives even in the darkest corners of the Wild West. This story will remind you that family isn't built from blood. It's built from the stubborn, terrifying decision to stay when everything in you says run. If that opening gave you chills, the ending will bring you to tears. Stay with me until the very last word. You will not regret it. Subscribe to join this journey, hit like if this story deserves to be heard, and share it with someone who believes that one person can still make a difference. Now tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight?
The child weighed less than 20 pounds. Silas knew because he had held his daughter for the last time at exactly that weight. Before he laid her in the pine box he had built with his own hands and nailed shut because the carpenter in town charged $2 and Silas only had $1. Now, 6 years later, another child lay in his arms, burning with fever, fingers curled into his shirt like she was gripping the edge of the world. His hands remembered everything his mind had tried to bury. 12 hours earlier. The horse stopped first. Silas pulled the reins, but Buck planted his hooves in the snow and would not move, ears pinned flat, nostrils blowing white into the dark. In 12 years of cavalry work, Silas Mallister had learned one thing about horses. When they will not go forward, there is either a bear ahead or something worse than a bear. He sat in the saddle and listened. The wind did not howl so much as cut, a high, thin sound through the pines like wire being pulled through bone. Snow came sideways, stinging every inch of exposed skin until feeling left entirely. Along the valley floor, frozen cattle carcasses lay half buried in the drifts. The great die-up was claiming everything that could not find shelter, and Silas had seen more dead stock in the last week than in his whole life combined. $4 remained from the 12 he had started with that month. A half-empty whiskey bottle swung from the saddle horn. A sack of flour was going damp in the snow behind him. He had been talking to Buck for the last mile because silence had become a sound he could not stand, and even the flat, rambling monologue of a man too lonely to recognize his own voice was better than nothing. Buck stamped and tossed his head toward the tree line. Silas drew his Colt and dismounted. He moved forward on foot, boots punching through snow that reached past his knees. Then he saw it. A wagon sitting crooked on the trail. No horses hitched to it. No fire, no lantern, just a dead wagon being buried an inch at a time. Not wrecked, stripped. The smell hit him first. Frozen urine, old blood on the sideboard, horseshoe prints leading away from empty harness traces. Someone had deliberately unhitched the team. This was no accident. Silas almost turned around. He had learned years ago that stopping for other people's trouble was the fastest way to find your own. But Buck would not move, and the horse had better instincts than any man Silas had ever ridden with. He grabbed the frozen canvas and pulled it back. 5 faces stared up at him. 5 children packed together under a single blanket that was more holes than cloth. The oldest was a girl, maybe 13, and she held a knife at his throat before he could blink. Not a kitchen blade. A man's knife with a bone handle and dried blood in the grip that she had not been able to scrub clean. Silas noticed the blood, filed it away, did not understand it yet. Behind her, a boy about 10 pressed himself against 3 smaller children, arms spread wide like a human shield. His jaw was clenched so tight the bones stood out in his face. A smaller girl clutched a rag doll with both hands, rocking herself slowly. Another boy, darker skin, black hair, watched Silas with eyes that did not belong on a child. His right hand rested on a knife at his own belt. And in the oldest girl's lap, the smallest one. 4 years old, maybe less, eyes half open, lips blue, chest barely rising. Silas checked the child. Fever, high, burning through the blanket like a coal. He knew these symptoms. Lily had started this way. The flush, the shallow breathing, the way the body went from shivering to still. He did not want to pick up this child. His hands shook. A voice in his head, clear and certain and his own, said it plain. You could not save Lily. You will not save this one either. You will just have to dig another hole in frozen ground. He nearly listened. The girl with the knife read the hesitation on his face. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not trust. Calculation. She lowered the blade not because she believed in him, but because she understood that if he walked away, her sister would die. She was gambling a life on a stranger's guilty conscience. She said nothing. She just held the child out. Silas took the girl. The heat of the fever burned through cloth and leather and skin. The terrible smallness of her. And something cracked open inside his chest that he immediately tried to seal shut again, because he had nailed that door closed 6 years ago and sworn he would never hold anything small and precious again. They moved into the storm. Silas broke trail with the smallest child against his chest. The older girl walked in his boot prints to save strength, and that told him more about her than any introduction could. She had learned young that wasted effort could kill you. The boy with the stutter could not hold the reins. His fingers had gone white with frostbite. The dark-haired boy took the leather from him without being asked and without a word. The little girl whispered to her doll. The sick child burned and burned. Halfway to the cabin, Silas heard hoofbeats behind them. Not one horse, many, coming fast. The older girl moved before Silas could speak. She shoved the little one face down into the snow and threw herself on top, one hand clamped over the child's mouth, the other white-knuckled on her knife. The dark-haired boy had his blade out and was crouching behind a drift, eyes flat, body coiled like a rattlesnake. The hoofbeats grew louder. Then a herd of mule deer broke through the tree line and thundered across the trail, 30 or 40 of them, eyes rolling with panic, driven by something behind them that Silas could not see. The deer vanished into the storm. Silence returned. The girl did not get up. She stayed on top of her sister for a long time, breathing hard, the knife still out. That was the posture of someone who had been hunted before. Not once. Not by animals. If this story reaches your heart, comment the place you are listening from and subscribe so you do not miss what happens next. Because I promise you, what these 5 children and 1 broken cowboy are about to go through will stay with you long after the last word. Now, let me tell you how they survived. Silas Mallister's cabin looked like a coffin laid on its side in the snow. The girl named Hannah stared at it from the trail and thought it was the safest place she had seen in 3 months. That should tell you everything about the 3 months she had lived through. They stumbled through the door into darkness that smelled of cold ash and whiskey. Silas kicked the coals in the hearth, threw kindling on top, and blew until flame caught. In the growing light, Hannah cataloged the room the way she cataloged every room. Exits first, 1 door, 1 window, 7 steps from the bed to the door, 4 from the door to the window. She filed those numbers the same way she filed every escape route in every place she had been since Missouri. Then the details. Empty whiskey bottles stacked under the bed like cordwood. A woman's dress still hanging on a wall peg, faded and untouched. And on the windowsill, a pair of children's shoes. Small, leather, coated in 6 years of dust. Nobody had moved them. Nobody had been able to. Hannah understood. This man had lost a child. She did not feel safer. She felt more afraid. A man grieving his dead daughter might want to replace her, and Hannah had learned that particular brand of kindness could be worse than outright cruelty. Men who wanted to save you often wanted to own you. She kept her knife in her fist. Silas laid Nettie on the bed near the fire and began working to bring the fever down. He heated water, he fumbled, his hands shook and not from the cold. When he reached for the pot, his grip was wrong and the water came off the fire too hot. Hannah screamed at him. "Stop! You will burn her skin." Silas froze. He looked at his hands like they belonged to someone else. Hannah pushed past him, tested the water herself, cooled it with snow, wrung out a cloth and pressed it to her sister's chest. She had done this before. 3 times on the trail west, nursing her mother through fevers. She had saved her mother twice. The 3rd time, nothing she did was enough. Sam stood in the corner of the cabin, checking every shadow. He did not speak. His brother Joe answered for him when Silas asked what the boy was doing. "He is counting exits," Joe said. "That is what Sam does." Joe himself did not sleep inside. He went out to the porch without a word and sat in the snow with his mother's knife across his knees. Silas saw him through the window, a 10-year-old boy sitting alone in a blizzard, guarding a door he had no reason to trust would not lock behind him. Silas did not drag him in. He opened the door, tossed a blanket out into the dark, and closed it again. From the window, he watched Joe stare at the blanket for a long time. Then the boy wrapped it around his shoulders and went on watching the trail. The night wore on. Nettie's breathing rattled like stones in a tin cup. Hannah sat beside the bed, changing compresses, counting breaths. She did not sleep. Neither did Silas. They sat in darkness on opposite sides of the small room, and the silence between them held the weight of 2 people who had both buried someone and learned that words were mostly useless in the face of it. Then Hannah spoke. 1 sentence, flat and quiet. "You know what they priced my sister at, $5. Silas said nothing. He did not say, "I will protect you." He did not make promises because he had heard enough promises break to know the sound by heart. He poured the last cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and set it on the floor in front of Hannah. She stared at it for a long time. Then she drank. Before dawn, while the children slept, Silas went back to the wagon. He needed to know what he was dealing with. The blizzard had eased enough to see 20 feet, and he rode Buck hard through the drifts until the dead wagon appeared again in the gray light. He searched it properly this time. Under the driver's seat, he found a loose board in the floor. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a black leather ledger. He opened it. The pages were filled with names, children's names. Next to each name, a dollar amount. Next to each dollar amount, a destination. Mine names, ranch names. A textile mill in Montana Territory. He found the names he was looking for. Hannah Dawson, $40. Samuel Dawson, $20. A notation in neat handwriting beside the amount. Stammer, reduced value, Clara Dawson, $30. Josiah Whitfield, $15, half-breed. Difficult placement, Annette Dawson, $5, mute and sickly, minimal return. Consider abandonment, $5 for a 4-year-old girl's life. That was what the man in the black coat had decided Nettie was worth. But it was not just 5 names. Silas turned the pages. Dozens of names. Going back years, dates, amounts, destinations. Children sold to mines and mills and ranches across 3 territories. Some entries had been crossed out with a single line, and beside those lines, a word that made Silas's stomach turn. Deceased. This was not one bad man. This was a system. Silas closed the book. His hands were steady now. Something had shifted inside him from reluctant rescuer to a man holding a lit fuse. He tucked the ledger inside his coat against his chest and rode back to the cabin through snow that was already covering his tracks. When he arrived, Nettie's eyes were open. She did not look at Hannah, did not look at Silas. She stared into the dark corner behind the hearth and began to tremble. Not from cold, from fear, as though she could see something there that no one else could see. Her mouth opened. No sound came out, but her lips shaped a single word over and over. No, no, no. Elk Creek had 43 buildings, two of which were churches, and not one of them was a safe place for a half-Cheyenne boy to walk into. Silas rode into town 2 days later with Joe sitting behind him on Buck's back. The ledger was hidden inside his coat, pressed against his ribs, and he carried it the way a man carried a grenade with the pin half pulled. He could not leave it at the cabin. A warning he had not yet understood kept echoing in his skull, something the sheriff had not yet said but would say before the day was out. The town sat in a valley like a collection of boxes someone had dropped and never bothered to pick up. Main Street was a frozen mud track lined with false-fronted buildings that tried to look bigger than they were. General store, saloon, church with a steeple that leaned slightly east, sheriff's office, livery stable. Maybe 40 structures total, most of them looking ready to give up if the wind blew hard enough. Joe felt the town before they reached it. His body went rigid against Silas's back. His hand moved to the knife on his belt. Most people in Elk Creek did not snarl at Joe or call him names. They did something worse. They simply did not see him. Eyes slid past like he was a fence post. Conversations paused when he walked by and resumed as though nothing had passed. One man, a teamster loading flour sacks onto a wagon, looked at Joe and spat on the frozen ground. Silas stopped walking. He turned and looked at the teamster, did not speak, did not reach for his gun, just looked. The silence stretched out between them like a wire being pulled tighter and tighter until something had to break. The teamster dropped his eyes first and went back to loading. On the boardwalk outside the general store, Joe spoke. His voice was sharp and angry and not at all grateful. "I do not need you standing up for me. I am not a dog on a leash." Silas was stung. Then he understood. The boy did not want protection. He wanted dignity. Those were different things, and most people never learned the difference. "You are right," Silas said. "Next time, handle it yourself." Joe was quiet for a long time as they walked. Then, so softly Silas almost missed it, the boy said, "But you did stand there." Silas kept his eyes forward. "I stood there because I wanted to. Nothing to do with you." They found the doctor's clinic behind the general store, a cramped room that smelled of carbolic acid and hay, because the woman who ran it treated horses and humans in the same space. There was no real doctor in Elk Creek. There was Elara Voss. She was 29 years old with dark hair pulled back tight, and hands that moved with the precision of someone who could not afford mistakes. She wore a man's shirt under a wool coat, and around her neck on a thin chain hung a gold wedding ring that caught the light when she moved. She did not take it off, not ever. Elara Voss was not impressed with Silas Mallister. She saw a man who smelled like yesterday's whiskey, had not changed his clothes in days, and was carrying a sick child while calling himself a guardian without a single piece of paper to prove it. Her first instinct was suspicion. She asked Silas to wait outside and spoke to Joe privately. "Is this man holding you against your will?" she asked. Joe looked at her. "You think he kidnapped us? Look at him. The man can barely take care of himself, let alone 5 children." Elara almost smiled. Almost. She examined Nettie with careful hands and a face that gave nothing away. The diagnosis was worse than Silas had assumed. Pneumonia, not simple fever. The child's lungs were filling. Without proper care over the next 3 to 5 days, she could die. "Do you know how to make a chest poultice?" Elara asked. "I know how to poultice a horse," Silas said. Elara looked at him for a long moment. "Close enough. I will show you the difference." She wrote instructions on a piece of brown paper. Herbs, measurements, timing. Her handwriting was precise and small and angry, as though each letter was being held accountable. When their fingers touched as he took the paper, neither of them acknowledged it. Then something happened that changed everything. Elara spoke a few words to Joe, not in English, in Cheyenne. Broken, clumsy, badly pronounced, but Cheyenne. Joe stopped cold. His hand came off his knife for the first time since they had entered town. "You speak Cheyenne," he said. "My husband ministered at the Wind River Reservation for 2 years. I learned a little." She paused. "Very little." It was a tiny moment. But for Joe, who had spent his whole life watching white adults look at him and see something less than human, it was enormous. For the first time, he looked at a grown woman who was not his mother and did not entirely raise his guard. At the general store, Silas met Maggie Holloway. She was 58 years old, with silver hair pulled back tight and eyes that missed nothing. She had run the store since her husband Edwin died 8 years ago, and she ran it better than he ever had. She was warm and generous and extended credit without being asked, and she stacked supplies on the counter that were worth far more than the $4 Silas could pay. Then Silas said a name. Victor Crane. Maggie dropped a tin of sugar. It hit the floor and burst open, white crystals scattering across the boards. Her hands shook. She recovered fast, bent down, began sweeping the sugar up with quick movements. But Silas saw it. The way she turned away, placed both hands flat on the counter, and closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. She knew that name. She knew it in her bones. She said nothing about it. Silas filed it away beside the blood on Hannah's knife and the ledger against his chest. The list of things he did not yet understand was growing. Outside the store, Sheriff Reuben Cross was waiting. He was 50 years old, with a belly that spoke of easy living and a badge that spoke of authority he might not have earned. He was red-faced and holding a cup of coffee, and he did not look like a man enjoying his morning. "Heard you rode in with a boy," Cross said, looking at Joe and then away and then back again. "He is with me," Silas said. Cross warned him about keeping orphans without legal authority. Talked about territorial law and proper guardians and institutions designed for children without parents. His voice was flat and rehearsed, like a man reading lines he did not believe from a script he did not write. But before Silas left, Cross said something that did not fit. He said it low, leaning in, his eyes shifting to make sure no one else could hear. "Mallister, if I were you, I would not keep anything important in that cabin of yours. Cabins burn awful easy in Wyoming." Silas held the sheriff's gaze. Cross looked away first, and Silas understood that the warning was not a threat. It was exactly the opposite. Cross was telling him that someone was coming for the cabin, and that whatever he was carrying needed to be somewhere that could not burn. On the ride home, Joe sat behind Silas in his usual silence. The mountains rose white and massive around them, and the trail wound through drifts that Buck shouldered through with the patience of a horse who had seen worse. Then Joe spoke. "The doctor woman. Her eyes are like my mother's." Silas turned in the saddle. "How so?" Joe thought about it for a long time. The wind blew snow across the trail, and the pines creaked under the weight of ice. "Like someone who cried a lot once," Joe said, and then decided to stop. Elara Voss had made 3 promises the day they buried Daniel. She would not cry in front of anyone. She would not trust any man who said the words, "I will be back." And she would never, absolutely never, get tangled up in the troubles of Silas Mallister. She broke the 3rd promise before dawn. It was not affection that drove her out of bed and onto her horse in the dark. It was professional conscience. The child with pneumonia needed monitoring, and Elara did not trust Silas Mallister to tell the difference between improving and dying. He knew horses. A 4-year-old girl was not a horse. She rode through the last of the blizzard with her medical bag strapped behind the saddle, and the cold eating through her coat. Daniel's ring bounced against her collarbone with every stride. She had not taken it off since the day they lowered him into the ground, and she would not take it off today, and she would not take it off tomorrow. That ring was a door between the woman she had been and the woman she was now, and as long as she wore it, she did not have to decide which one was real. The cabin materialized out of the snow like a bad memory. Smoke crawled from the chimney. A horse was tied outside. And standing in the doorway with a rifle was an old man she had never met. 70 years old if he was a day, with a face like cracked leather and hands that looked capable of breaking a horse or a man's jaw depending on what the morning required. Tom Kincaid lowered the rifle when he saw her. "You must be the doctor," he said, "and you must be the neighbor. I am the only thing standing between this cabin and a catastrophe. Come in. The coffee is terrible. Inside, Elara met the children properly for the first time. Her responses were clinical, precise, and completely different from the way Silas handled them. She checked Hannah first, took one look at the girl's face, her wrists, the way her collarbones jutted out beneath her dress, and understood immediately what no one else had said aloud. "How long have you been starving yourself?" Elara asked. Hannah went rigid. The knife hand twitched. No one had ever asked that question. Everyone praised her for being strong, for holding the family together, for being so brave. No one had looked past the armor to see the girl underneath it, wasting away because she gave every extra mouthful to younger mouths. "I eat," Hannah said. "You eat last, after everyone else, and not enough." Elara's voice held no warmth and no judgment, just the flat assessment of someone who had seen starvation before and knew its face. "You are malnourished. If you keep this up, you will collapse, and then who takes care of them?" Hannah had no answer. No one had ever framed her sacrifice as a problem before. It knocked something loose in her that she spent the rest of the day trying to shove back into place. Elara examined Sam's hands next. 2 fingers on his left hand had gone white and then gray from frostbite, and the discoloration was spreading. She held his hand up to the light, and her mouth tightened. "When did this happen?" she asked. "During the blizzard." Sam's stutter snagged on the words. He clenched his jaw and forced them through. I could not feel them. If these are not treated properly, you could lose them." Elara looked at Silas across the room. "He needs warm soaks 3 times a day, herb compresses, and someone who will actually follow instructions. Can you manage that?" "I managed 12 years of cavalry," Silas said, "and yet you cannot keep a cabin clean enough to prevent infection." She pointed at the floor, the blankets, the unwashed dishes stacked by the basin. "This place is a breeding ground. If you want these children to survive the winter, you need to start acting like someone who cares about more than making it to tomorrow." Silas's temper flared. "You think I do not know? I have $4. You want me to build a hospital? I want you to put down the bottle and start behaving like a grown man with responsibilities." The silence that followed was the kind that could cut glass. Tom Kincaid stood in the corner, pretending to inspect the wall. Hannah watched from the shadows with something that might have been the beginning of respect. Silas said nothing because there was nothing to say. She was right. He knew she was right. And being right while standing in his home and looking at him with those eyes that Joe said were like his mother's was more than Silas could handle before breakfast. Outside, Joe was kneeling in the snow near the tree line. He held something in his hand, turning it over carefully. An eagle feather. Long, perfect, banded brown and white. In Cheyenne tradition, an eagle feather was sacred. It carried meaning that could not be held in English words. But Joe did not know the ceremony. His mother, Laughing Bird, had died before she could teach him everything. She had taught him how to read weather and track game and hold a knife and speak the truth even when it cost you. She had not taught him what to do when the sacred found you and you did not know how to answer. He stood in the snow holding the feather and cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just tears on a 10-year-old face, falling into snow that would cover them in minutes. He was not crying because the world was cruel to him. He was crying because his mother was dead, and the things she would have taught him were dead with her. And there were parts of himself he would never be able to reach because she was the only bridge, and the bridge was gone. He hid the feather in his coat before anyone could see. Later, quietly, he brought it to Elara. She was washing instruments in the basin when he appeared at her side, holding the feather out with a kind of desperate shame. "Do you know what you are supposed to do with one of these?" he asked. Elara dried her hands. She looked at the feather, then at the boy. She could have lied, could have made something up to comfort him. She did not. "I know very little," she said. "Not enough to teach you properly." Joe's eyes dropped. He started to pull the feather back. "But I know people who do," Elara added. "At Wind River, when this is over, I will take you there." It was a small promise, the kind adults made to children all the time and rarely kept, but it was the first time anyone had promised Joe a future instead of just managing his present. He looked at her for a long time, measuring. deciding. Then he tucked the feather back into his coat and walked away without another word. That night, Nettie spiked a fever that made everything before look mild. The child's body arched off the bed, her breathing reduced to a thin whistle that barely moved air. Ilara barked orders. Silas followed them. They worked side by side in firelight, boiling water, wringing compresses, packing the child's chest and armpits with warm cloths, while Hannah held her sister's hand and whispered things that were not words, just sounds, the primal language of someone holding on to someone who was slipping away. In the chaos, Silas's hand closed over Ilara's across the compress on Nettie's chest. For 1 second, their fingers interlocked, slick with water and sweat, and neither of them breathed. Then the moment passed, and they pulled apart and went on working as though it had not happened. But it had happened, and they both knew it. Tom Kincaid had seen the empty bottles under Silas's bed. He waited until the crisis with Nettie passed, waited until the children were asleep and Ilara was dozing in the chair. And then he followed Silas outside into the cold. 6 years I watched you die by inches, Tom said. His voice was low and hard and carried the authority of a man who had earned the right to speak plain. I left you to it because I figured dying was your business and nobody else's. But there are 5 children in that cabin now, so I will say this one time. You take another drink under that roof, and I will throw you out of your own house and raise those kids myself. And you know I will do it. Silas looked at the old man, 67 years old, Confederate veteran, a man who had guarded a prison camp where Union soldiers starved to death and had spent every day since trying to make up for it. Tom Kincaid did not bluff, he did not threaten. He stated facts and then followed through, and that was the most terrifying thing about him. Silas went inside. He took the whiskey bottle from under the bed, walked outside, tipped it over and poured the last of the bourbon into the snow, where it melted a small amber hole, and then froze again. His hand shook while he did it. That shaking was the truest thing about him in that moment, truer than any words he could have spoken. Past midnight, a gunshot split the silence, distant but sharp from the direction of town. Everyone in the cabin froze. Silas grabbed his Colt. Tom went to the door and listened. Nothing followed, no second shot. Just the wind and the dark and the sound of 5 children's hearts beating too fast. Morning brought a rider with news. Someone had shot Reverend Pope's dog and hung the poor creature from the church gate with a sign nailed to its collar. The sign read, "Those who harbor stolen property lose more than dogs." Silas thought about the ledger hidden inside his coat. He thought about the names in it. He thought about the word that had been written beside some of those names. Deceased. The bonds forming in this cabin were forming under a ticking clock, and the clock was getting louder. The next morning, Hannah woke Silas before dawn. Her voice was calm in the way that frightened him most, the calm of a child who had already calculated the worst outcome and made peace with it. Someone was here last night. Footprints around the barn. One person, leather-soled boots, high heel. Silas pulled on his coat and went outside. Hannah was right. A single set of boot prints circled the barn, approached the cabin door, and retreated south toward the main trail. And beside the prints, scratched into the snow with a stick, someone had written a number. 5. The number of children inside. The message was clear. We know what you have, and we are coming to collect. Hannah knew 3 ways to kill a man with a knife. She did not learn them from a book. She learned them on the 4th night out of Missouri, when a stranger's hand slid under Clara's blanket at 2 in the morning. She had not been sleeping. She never slept deeply anymore, not since Mama died, not since the world became a place where a 13-year-old girl was the only wall between her family and whatever the darkness decided to send. She heard the canvas flap of the wagon cover lift. She heard boots on the tailgate. She heard breathing that was not Sam's, not Clara's, not Nettie's. Wrong breathing. Hungry breathing. She saw the hand, long fingers, dirty nails, reaching under the blanket where Clara lay curled around her doll. What happened next lived in Hannah's body, more than her memory. The feel of the bone handle in her fist, the hitch of someone's breath that she realized later was her own, the resistance of cloth, and then something harder beneath, and the sound that a man makes when a blade finds the space between his ribs. She did not remember pulling the knife out. She remembered dragging Clara into the dark. She remembered running without looking back. She took his knife because she had dropped hers in the wagon, and she did not go back for it. She never saw the man again. She did not know if he was alive or dead. And every night since, she lay awake waiting for someone to come find her and say the words that lived in the bottom of her stomach like a stone. You killed a man. The knife she carried now was his, both weapon and evidence. Her hands had grown so accustomed to its weight that she felt naked without it. She could not set it down, she could not explain why. And she could not tell anyone what she had done, because telling someone would make it real in a way that silence did not. She stood in the doorway of Silas's cabin on the morning they found the footprints and watched the man and the old neighbor follow the tracks south into the tree line. She held the knife in her fist and felt the old blood in the grip under her fingers, blood she had scrubbed and could not fully remove. Silas and Tom tracked the prints for half a mile before losing them on the main road, where wagon ruts and hoofprints overlapped into chaos. Tom studied the trail and spoke without looking up. Not Crane. Crane does not walk anywhere. This was a scout, someone paid to look and report back. They cannot find much worth reporting, Silas said. 5 kids and a drunk. Former drunk, Tom corrected him. And a man holding a book that could bring down half the territory. That is worth plenty. On the ride back, Silas made a decision. He was done waiting. He and Tom spent the afternoon rigging the perimeter using skills Silas had learned in 12 years of cavalry reconnaissance. Thin wire strung between fence posts at ankle height around the barn. Tin cans hung on the cabin door. Trip lines stretched across the approaches from south and east, rigged to pull a string of cans that would rattle like hellfire if anyone tripped them in the dark. It was practical work, period work, the kind of thing a frontier man did when he could not afford a sentry and could not afford to sleep either. Tom handled the wire while Silas hammered stakes. Neither of them talked much. The work was its own conversation. Inside the cabin, Sam watched through the window. He had been quiet all morning, quieter than usual, his stutter coiling behind his teeth like a spring wound too tight. When Silas came inside for water, Sam was waiting. "Teach me to shoot," he said. The words came out clean. No stutter. The want behind them had burned straight through the block in his throat. Silas looked at the boy. 10 years old. Hands steady as stone. Which was a hell of a thing, given that the rest of him shook with every third sentence. Sam's hands had always been his true voice. They never trembled. They never lied. "You're 10 years old," Silas said. "I know how old I am. Teach me to shoot. It is loud, it kicks, and it changes you. Once you pull a trigger, you cannot unpull it." Sam's jaw tightened. "People have already died. My pa died. My mama died. I could not do anything about it because I was too small and too young and too useless." The stutter vanished on the last word. The emotion burned right through it like fire through dry grass. "I am not useless anymore. Teach me." Silas taught him, basics only. Stance, breathing, sight picture. He placed the rifle in Sam's hands and showed him how to set it against his shoulder, how to breathe in and let half the breath out, how to find the target down the barrel and squeeze, not pull. Sam squeezed. The rifle cracked across the valley like a whip, and the boy's stutter came roaring back, worse than before, his whole mouth locking up as though the sound of the gunshot had triggered something buried deep. The crack of a rifle, the last sound his father ever heard. Sam set the gun down, turned away, gripped the fence with both hands, knuckles white, every muscle in his body fighting something that could not be fought with muscle. Silas stood behind him, did not touch him, did not speak, just stood. Sam turned back, picked up the rifle, raised it, fired again, still shaking, still stuttering, but he fired. "Good," Silas said. "One more. That is enough for today." Sam lowered the rifle and looked up at Silas with eyes that held no stutter, no hesitation. Just a boy looking at a man and seeing something he needed. "Thank you," Sam said. Silas nodded and said nothing else because saying more would have meant acknowledging that he had just put a weapon in the hands of a 10-year-old, and no matter how necessary it might be, that was not something a man should feel good about. That evening, Joe and Sam got into a fight. It started over nothing, the way fights between boys always do. An argument about who could throw a rock farther escalated into shoving, and shoving escalated into Joe tackling Sam into a snowdrift. And then they were rolling and punching and cursing in the inventive way that 10-year-old boys curse, which is to say badly and with great enthusiasm. Hannah stormed out and yelled. Silas pulled them apart by their coat collars. 5 minutes later, they were sitting side by side on the porch eating cold cornbread as though nothing had happened. Sam offered Joe the bigger piece. Joe took it without thanking him. And that was how brotherhood started on the frontier. Not through speeches, through fists, and then food. Clara sat on the floor near the hearth with Nettie's head in her lap. She held up her doll and pointed it at the shoes on the windowsill, the small, dusty leather shoes that had not been moved in 6 years. She did not ask through Rosie. She asked directly, her own voice, her own eyes. "Those are your little girl's shoes, are they not?" Silas stopped moving. His whole body went still the way a man's body went still when a bullet passed too close. "Yes." "Was she scared of the dark?" His throat closed. "Yes, very." "Nettie is scared of the dark too," Clara said. Maybe they would have been good friends. The words landed like a fist, innocent and devastating and precise in the way that only a 7-year-old could manage, because children did not know how to soften a truth. And sometimes the unsoftened truth was the one that mattered most. Silas left the room. He stood outside in the cold for a long time, breathing, gripping the porch rail, while something behind his ribs expanded and contracted in a rhythm that felt like grief, but might have been something else, something he was not ready to name. That night, past 10, a knock came at the cabin door. Silas grabbed his Colt and opened it to find Elara Voss standing in the snow. Her face was bloodless. Her hands were shaking. Not from cold. "You need to know this," she said. "My husband, Daniel, before he died, he was investigating a child trafficking network in Wyoming territory." She swallowed, reached inside her coat, pulled out a journal, brown leather, worn soft from handling. "I found this after he died. I have had it for 2 years. But Daniel wrote it in code, a cipher that he and Reverend Pope developed during their seminary days. I have never been able to read it." She held the journal out. "The name Crane is on every page. I can see that much. But the rest is locked." She looked at Silas with those eyes that Joe had described perfectly, eyes that had cried a lot once and then decided to stop. "We need Pope," she said. Daniel Voss did not fall from a horse. Elara had always known that. She just could not prove it. Not until Reverend Elijah Pope sat at Silas's kitchen table with the journal open, his one remaining hand tracing the cipher line by line, and began to read aloud the words her dead husband had hidden. Pope had arrived that morning riding hard from Elk Creek with his empty left sleeve pinned to his coat and his Bible in his saddlebag. He was a hard man, forged in the fires of Shiloh where he had lost his arm and found something harder than bone to replace it. He and Daniel Voss had been close friends, seminary brothers who had developed a private shorthand during their studies, a cipher built from scripture references and Latin abbreviations that no one else alive could read. The room was quiet while Pope worked, just his voice and the fire and the scratch of pen on paper as he transcribed the decoded entries. Silas sat across from him, arms folded. Elara stood by the window still as stone, Daniel's ring pressed between her fingers through the fabric of her shirt. Tom leaned against the wall. The children were asleep in the other room, except Hannah. Hannah sat in the shadows at the edge of the room, her knife across her knees, listening to everything. Pope read slowly. Pope read. His voice was the voice of a man used to reading sacred text, measured and deliberate, giving each word its weight. The journal painted a picture that made Silas's blood run cold. Victor Crane was the middleman. He traveled the wagon trails collecting orphans, children from dead families, desperate families, families who could be convinced or coerced into signing papers they did not understand. He brought the children to placement sites across the territory, mines mostly, but also mills, ranches, anywhere that needed small hands and did not ask questions. Above Crane was Judge Cornelius Stark, territorial judge in Casper, who provided the legal machinery. Fraudulent custody orders, forged guardianship documents, court seals applied to papers that would not survive 5 minutes of honest scrutiny but did not need to, because no one in the territory had the power or the will to scrutinize them. And the financial thread. The money. Payments from mine operators flowing through ledger books, laundered through legitimate businesses, funneling upward to Stark and downward to Crane. And the man who had kept those books, who had recorded every transaction with the careful hand of a trained accountant, was Edwin Holloway, Maggie's husband. Pope read the entry aloud. Margaret Holloway continues her late husband's ledger work. She believes she has no choice. Crane holds evidence of her complicity from Edwin's tenure. She is not evil. She is trapped. But children continue to disappear through her accounts. Elara's face went white, then red, then something beyond color, something that lived in the space between betrayal and understanding. Maggie Holloway had been kind to her after Daniel died, brought food, sat with her through the long evenings, held her hand at the funeral, and all along Maggie had been part of the machine that might have killed Daniel. Silas spoke into the silence. How many people in this town knew? How many watched children get carried through and pretended they did not see? Pope closed the journal. His face held the expression of a man who had been fighting this quietly for 2 years and was only now finding out how deep the rot went. There is more, he said. And what he read next stopped the room. Crane, Victor, former minister, defrocked, St. Louis. Daughter, Miriam Crane. Placed at Black Rock Mine, October of 1879. Deceased, March of 1880, age 8. Crane arranged the placement himself. Told the mine superintendent the child was an orphan. Pope looked up from the journal. She was not an orphan, he said. She was his daughter. Nobody moved. The fire popped. Somewhere in the next room, one of the children murmured in sleep. Silas absorbed it. The man who was hunting these 5 children had once sold his own daughter into the same darkness. And she had died there, underground, at 8 years old. And Crane had not stopped, could not stop, because stopping would mean admitting what he had done. He had to believe that sending children into the mines was saving them. Had to believe it the way a drowning man had to believe the water was not real, because if it was not mercy, then it was murder. And the first murder was his own child. That night, Silas rode into town. Not to the store, to Maggie's home. A small house behind the store, neat and quiet, with lace curtains in the windows and a fence that needed paint. He knocked. Maggie opened the door in a housecoat, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. She saw the journal in his hand, and her face did not change. That was the tell. A person who did not know what was in that journal would have asked. Maggie did not ask. She stepped aside and let him in. Silas placed the journal on the kitchen table. Maggie sat down across from it and looked at it the way a person looks at a rattlesnake coiled on their floor, with resignation, with the knowledge that this moment had been coming for a very long time. I knew you would find out, she said. I just hoped it would take longer. She told him everything, not in the broken, weeping way of someone begging forgiveness. In the flat, exhausted way of someone who had been carrying a weight too long and was relieved to finally set it down, even if setting it down meant being crushed by what came next. Edwin started it because of debts, gambling debts, bad investments, the usual vices of a man who appeared prosperous and was not. Crane offered a solution. Keep the books, route the money. It paid well, and it was easy to look away when the payments came in neat columns and the children were just names on a page. When Edwin died, Crane came to Maggie. Two choices: continue the work or be exposed as an accomplice. Maggie chose silence. She kept the books for 5 more years. Then, 3 years ago, she stopped. Told Crane she was done. He let her go because he had already transitioned to other arrangements, but he kept the evidence of her involvement as insurance. I watched 17 children pass through this town in 8 years, Maggie said. Her voice did not shake. Her eyes did not leave the table. I counted every one. Silas looked at this woman who had given him food and credit and kindness, and understood that kindness and guilt could live inside the same person. That people were not one thing, that the line between complicity and survival was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. And you did nothing, he said, and I did nothing. Until you showed up with 5 more, and I thought, if I do not do something this time, I will never do anything at all. Silas had a choice. He could expose Maggie, turn her into Pope, to any authority who would listen. And in doing so, he would lose his only ally inside the town. The only person who knew the system from the inside. The only person whose testimony could bring the whole structure down. Or he could keep her secret and become another version of the people who looked away. He chose neither. He chose a third path. You will testify, he said, when the time comes. Everything. 17 children. Names. Dates. Every dollar that passed through your books. You owe them at least that. Maggie met his eyes for the first time. I owe them more than that. When Silas rode back to the cabin, the moon was high and the snow was blue-silver in its light. Tom Kincaid was standing at the door with his rifle, and the expression on his face said the night was not finished. Someone cut Buck's saddle cinch, Tom said, cut clean through. If you had ridden downhill tomorrow without checking, you would have broken your neck. Silas walked to the barn. The door hung half open. On the handle, in the moonlight, there was a smear of fresh blood. Someone had cut themselves on the wire he had strung that afternoon. Good. That meant the traps worked. That meant someone was close enough to touch, and they were getting desperate. Inside the barn, on Buck's stall door, scratched deep into the wood with a nail, were 3 words. Give them back. Crane did not send men this time. He sent paper. And paper, Silas discovered, was more dangerous than bullets. Sheriff Reuben Cross rode up to the cabin the next afternoon with a folded document in his hand, and a look on his face like a man being marched to his own execution. He dismounted slowly. He did not draw his weapon. He looked at Silas, and then at the ground, and then at the mountains as though hoping they might swallow him whole. The document was a court order signed by Territorial Judge Cornelius Stark. It commanded the immediate surrender of 5 minor children currently in the unlawful possession of one Silas Mallister. Custody was to be transferred to Victor Crane, authorized guardian under territorial statute. Compliance was required within 48 hours. Failure to comply would result in arrest on charges of kidnapping and obstruction. The seal at the bottom was real. The signature was real. The legal language was sound. And it was all built on lies, every word of it. A cathedral of fraud constructed by a corrupt judge and a child trafficker who had learned how to make the machinery of law serve the machinery of evil. Cross spoke quietly while no one else was near. Mallister, I do not want to do this. But if I do not execute this order, Stark sends someone else. Someone who will not knock first. Silas looked at the sheriff. Really looked. And saw not a villain but another casualty of the system. A man being ground between gears he could not stop and could not escape, because a secret held by a dead man's accomplice kept him chained to obedience. Give me the 48 hours, Silas said. If I cannot find a way out, I will let you do your job. Cross looked at him. They both knew it was a lie. But Cross needed the lie in order to walk away. And Silas needed Cross to walk away in order to have time. And so the lie served them both, the way lies on the frontier often did. When Cross was gone, Silas laid out 3 plans. Tom would ride to Casper. He had contacts there from the war, men who knew men, and he could get to a telegraph office and send word to the federal marshal's office in Denver. Pope's letters had been going unanswered for months, but a telegraph with decoded journal evidence might land on a desk that letters had not reached. Elara would take the decoded journal to Pope. Pope would begin drafting a formal complaint for federal review. He would include everything: the names, the dates, the money trail, the mine operations, and the entry about Miriam Crane, which was the kind of detail that made federal judges sit up and pay attention. And Silas would prepare the backup plan. If everything else failed, he would take the children and run. North across the territorial line into Montana, where Stark's jurisdiction ended and a new start was theoretically possible. But running had a price. If he ran, Silas became a kidnapper under territorial law. He could never come back. And behind the cabin, under snow that was already melting at the edges, Catherine and Lily lay in graves he had tended every Sunday for 6 years. Running meant leaving them. Forever. That night, after the plans were set and Tom was saddling up for the ride to Casper and Elara was packing the journal for Pope, Hannah found Silas alone by the fire. She sat down across from him. She held the knife in her lap, and in the firelight, the old blood in the grip looked black. She told him, not all at once, in fragments. Sensation more than narrative. The feel of the handle, the sound of the canvas, the hand that did not belong reaching for Clara in the dark. What she did, what she heard, what she did not stay to see. When she finished, the cabin was very quiet. He was touching your sister, Silas said. Yes. Then you did the right thing. But what if he died? The question hung in the air between them. Hannah's eyes were dry, but her hands shook on the knife. Then he died from what he did, Silas said at last. Not from what you did, Hannah cried, for the first time since her mother died. Not loud, not dramatic, just tears running down her face in the firelight, falling onto the blade in her lap. Silas did not embrace her, not yet. The moment was not right for that. He sat close enough for her to know he was there, far enough to give her the space she needed to break without being watched. Later, when the tears had stopped and the fire had burned low, Hannah spoke again. And what she said was the most honest thing Silas had ever heard from a child. I do not want to do this anymore. I want someone else to worry about them. I want to be 13. I want to not have to think about whether everyone has eaten or whether the door is locked or whether someone is coming in the dark. Just for one day. Just for one single day, I want to not care. Then horror crossed her face. Because saying it felt like abandoning them, even in thought, even in exhaustion. The guilt hit her like a physical blow, and Silas watched her try to take it back, try to rebuild the wall. That is not selfish, he said. That is honest, and you are allowed to be honest. Hannah looked at him. And for one moment, just one, she was not a soldier or a mother or a wall. She was 13 years old and she was tired, and someone had told her it was all right to be tired, and that was enough. It was not a fix. It was not a rescue. But it was a door opening in a wall that had been shut for a very long time, and sometimes a door was all you needed. Tom returned from Casper at midnight. His horse was lathered and his face was grim. He had not brought a federal marshal. He had brought news. Stark knew about the journal. Someone in Casper had talked, or someone in Elk Creek, or the system had its own ways of knowing when it was threatened. The result was the same. Stark sent men, Tom said, catching his breath in the doorway. Not Crane, someone else. 8 riders, armed. They will be here before dawn. Silas looked out the window. The sky was black from horizon to horizon. How long? 5 hours, maybe 4. There was no cavalry, No federal marshal riding hard through the snow at the last possible moment. No miracle. There was a man, an old man, a woman doctor, 5 children, 2 rifles, and 4 hours until dawn. Silas stood in the center of the cabin and felt the walls closing in. Not the physical walls, the walls inside him. The ones he had built over 12 years of riding and fighting and following orders and watching things happen that should not have happened and doing nothing to stop them, because those were the orders, and orders were easier to follow than conscience. A Cheyenne family being run off their land, soldiers whooping like it was a game, a woman carrying a child stumbling, falling. Silas on his horse watching. Those were the orders. He rode past. He had been riding past ever since. And now, at 2 in the morning in a cabin in the Bighorn foothills with 5 sleeping children and 8 armed men 4 hours away, the horse he had been riding for 6 years stopped. He stood up, went to the barn, began saddling Buck. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times. 1 horse, 1 man, south toward the border. He could be in Montana by morning. Gone before anyone woke, gone before the guns arrived. Gone the way he had always been gone, riding past, riding through, riding away from everything that asked him to stand still and be counted. Joe was standing in the barn doorway. The boy said nothing. His mother's knife hung at his side. His eyes were steady and dark and old beyond any age that should have been asked of them. Silas saw those eyes, and in them he found not anger, not betrayal, something worse. Recognition. Joe had seen men walk away before. His father, every white man since, every man who said one thing and did another. And here was one more. Joe's face said everything without a single word. I knew it. I always knew it. Silas stood there with the saddle half on Buck's back. The horse turned his head and looked at him with that patient, unblinking gaze that horses gave you when they knew something you did not. The silence in the barn was enormous. It contained 6 years of grief and 12 years of war, and one boy who was waiting to find out whether this man was different from every other man who had left. Silas took the saddle off, set it on the rail, walked past Joe without speaking, went back into the cabin. Joe followed. Not right away. After a long moment. He sat down in his usual spot by the door with his knife across his knees. He did not look at Silas, but he was there, and that was enough. For now. Silas walked through the cabin. He passed the windowsill. Lily's shoes sat there, dusty and small. And beside them, placed there by someone, perhaps Clara, perhaps Hannah, were Nettie's shoes. Tiny and worn and set right next to Lily's, as though the 2 girls might walk out together into some world where children did not get sick and fathers did not fail. He stopped, looked at the 2 pairs of shoes, then kept walking. But the image stayed. He woke everyone up. I will not make decisions for you without asking you, he said. So I am asking. He laid out the situation. 8 men coming before dawn. 3 options. Run and hide at the abandoned mine 5 miles northeast. Fight from the cabin with 2 rifles against 8 guns. Or surrender the children and hope that the law corrected itself in time. Hannah spoke first. No surrender. Sam's stutter was bad, but his voice was clear. Never. Joe drew his knife. No words needed. And Clara did something she had never done before. She set Rosie on the floor. Deliberately. With care, the way you set down something you loved but no longer needed to hide behind. She looked at Silas with her own eyes, her own voice. No doll. No shield. I do not want to go, she said. I want to stay here, with you. Silas felt something crack open inside him that he had no time to examine. He looked at Nettie, awake now, propped in Hannah's arms. The 4-year-old's gray eyes found his. She did not speak. She pressed her small hand flat against her chest, over her heart. Silas chose the 4th option, the one nobody expected. He would ride out to meet them, not fight them, not run from them. Meet them, carrying the ledger and the decoded journal. He was gambling on something that might not exist anymore, the conscience of hired men. "These are not Crane's soldiers," Silas said. "They are hired guns. They work for money, not belief. Money has limits. Conscience, if any of them still have one, does not. I'm going to ride out there and tell them what they are actually protecting. And I am betting that at least some of them will not want to be the men who helped sell children to mine shafts." Tom Kincaid stared at him. "That is the craziest gamble I have ever heard. You got a better idea?" Tom was quiet for a long time. Then, "No, but I am coming with you." Ilara did not agree. She argued, hard. She wanted to run. "Take the children to Montana tonight. Leave now, in the dark, before the riders came." She wanted to control the outcome. She wanted a plan with guaranteed results and measurable risks and a clear line between success and failure, because that was how Ilara Voss had survived the last 2 years. Control, certainty, the iron belief that if she managed every variable, she could prevent another loss. Silas refused, and Ilara faced the thing she had been avoiding since Daniel's death. She could not control this man, could not control this situation, could not guarantee the result. She could only choose. Go with him or stay behind. The fight went out of her. Not surrender. Something harder than surrender. Acceptance. "If you die out there," she said, "I will be furious." "Why?" "Because I have already lost one good man. I am not interested in losing another. It was a declaration of love. No flowers, no poetry, no soft music or trembling hands. Just a woman standing in a cabin at 3 in the morning telling a man she did not want him to die. On the frontier, in that winter, in that darkness, it was everything." Silas reached for her hand, held it 1 second, then let go. No kiss. Not yet. Not the right time. But enough. Daniel's ring caught the firelight on its chain against her throat. Silas saw it, said nothing, because he understood that loving someone new did not mean erasing someone lost. He had Catherine, she had Daniel. They were not replacements. They were people strong enough to carry the past and still walk forward. He turned to Hannah. "If we are not back by the time the sun clears the ridge, you take everyone to the abandoned mine northeast. Do not wait. Do not come back." Hannah nodded. "You will come back. That is the plan." "That is not a plan. That is a promise. I do not make promises." "Then I will make it for you. You will come back." 3 riders moved into the dark. An old man with a Confederate past and a rifle that had not missed a target in 40 years. A woman doctor wearing her dead husband's ring and carrying his journal. And a cowboy with nothing left to lose, except 5 children standing in the cabin doorway, watching him go. The smallest one was being held by the oldest, and neither of them looked away until the riders disappeared into the black. Silas did not look back. If he looked back, he would stay. And if he stayed, they would all die together. He fixed his eyes forward, checked his colt, and rode toward the sound of 8 horses coming through the snow. They met Crane's party at the frozen fork of Willow Creek, where the trail split in 2 directions. One path led north toward the cabin, the other led nowhere. Crane rode point, black leather coat, gray beard trimmed neat. A gold watch chain catching the first gray light before dawn. His smile was the coldest thing within 10 miles. Behind him sat Sheriff Reuben Cross, rigid in his saddle, holding the reins with white-knuckled hands. Behind Cross, 6 hired guns, with rifles across their laps, and faces that said they had not been paid enough to think about what they were doing. And behind them all, a wagon. The wagon meant they planned to take the children today, load them up like freight, and haul them south to whatever mine or mill had the highest bid. Silas stopped Buck at the center of the trail. Tom pulled up beside him. Ilara flanked the other side. 3 against 8. The math was impossible. Nobody spoke. The silence lasted longer than it should have. Wind moved across the snow, lifting fine white powder that swirled between the horses. Leather creaked on saddles. A horse stamped and blew. Crane sat perfectly still, his gloved hands folded on the horn of his saddle. Silas sat equally still, the ledger and the journal inside his coat, his Colt on his hip, his eyes not on Crane but on the 6 men behind him. He let the silence grow, let it expand until it became its own kind of pressure, until the men in the back started shifting in their saddles and glancing at each other, because silence in the face of violence was more unnerving than shouting. Then Silas spoke, and he did not speak to Victor Crane. He spoke to the hired men. "Do you know what you are doing here? You are escorting a man who buys and sells children, not cattle, not horses. Children. A 4-year-old who has not spoken a word since she watched her mother die. A 7-year-old who talks to a doll because she is too scared to speak for herself. A 10-year-old boy who stutters because he saw his father shot dead in front of him. A 10-year-old boy who is half Cheyenne and got priced at $15 because his blood was not the right color." He paused. "Let it land. Do any of you have daughters?" 2 men exchanged glances. One of them, a weathered man in his 40s with a wedding band on his left hand, took his hand off his rifle and rested it on his thigh. His name was Harlan. He had a wife in Colorado and 2 girls under the age of 10, and right now he was thinking about them. Crane spoke, his voice tight. "I am paying you. Do your job." Harlan looked at Crane. "You paid me $20 to help roust an old man and some kids. You did not say anything about selling children to mines." Crane's composure cracked by a fraction. "This is a legal matter. I have a court order." Silas pulled the black ledger from his coat and held it up. "Recognize this, Crane? You left it in the wagon. Careless of you. Every name, every price, every child you have sold in the last 8 years." He opened the book. Read aloud. "Miriam Crane, Black Rock Mine. October 1879. Age 7 at placement. Deceased March 1880. Age 8. Silas closed the book, looked at Crane. "Including your daughter." The words hit Crane like a bullet. Not the ledger, not the evidence. Those 3 words, your daughter. His face went white, then gray. The mask did not crack, it shattered. The polished smile, the smooth voice, the righteous certainty that he was a man performing charity in a cruel world. All of it fell away, and what remained was a 52-year-old man on a horse in the snow who had been lying to himself for 8 years and had just been stripped of every lie at once. Ilara held up Daniel's journal. "This is the journal of Reverend Daniel Voss. He investigated your operation for 2 years before he was murdered. Every transaction, every name, every dollar, decoded by Reverend Pope. A copy has been sent to the Federal Marshal's office in Denver." She was bluffing about the copy, but Crane did not know that, and the uncertainty spread through the hired guns like a brush fire. Cross had been silent through all of it, rigid, staring straight ahead. The badge he no longer officially wore sat in his coat pocket like a stone. Then he moved, slowly. He reached into his coat, removed the badge, looked at it in the dawn light, and set it on his saddle horn. "Crane," he said, and his voice cracked down the middle. "I have followed your orders for 3 years. You held my secret to keep me in line. But I looked at those children's faces the other day, and I saw my daughter." He turned to face Silas. "The secret Crane holds is this. 10 years ago, I shot a man named Floyd Mercer in the alley behind the saloon. It was self-defense. There were no witnesses. Crane was there that night. He has owned me ever since." Cross looked straight ahead, at nothing, at everything. "Now you all know. I do not care anymore. I would rather sit in the territorial lockup than help sell one more child." The hired guns dissolved. Harlan turned his horse first and rode south without a word. 3 others followed. The last 2 looked at Crane, looked at Cross, and left. Crane sat alone on his horse. The dawn light was red behind him. His hands trembled on the reins. He drew his pistol, but he did not point it at Silas. He pressed it under his own chin. "You do not understand. I am not a monster. My daughter, Miriam. She died in Black Rock Mine. She was 8 years old. I put her there because I thought she would have food, a roof. I could not feed her. I could not." His voice broke. "I had to believe it was saving them. All of them. Every child. Because if it was not saving them, then I killed her. I killed my own child. And I cannot live with." Ilara stepped forward. She moved the way she moved with wounded animals and dying men. Steady, calm, without fear. "Mr. Crane, put the gun down." The man on the horse sobbed. The sound was ugly and raw and human, not a villain crumbling. A father collapsing under the weight of a truth he had spent 8 years outrunning. Tom stepped in and took the pistol from Crane's shaking hand. Cross dismounted and put Crane in irons, his hands steady, his face blank. The last official act of a man who no longer held any official authority. They rode back to the cabin. Crane sat in his saddle like a broken marionette, head down, shoulders rounded, the gold watch chain swinging with each step of his horse. The sun came up and turned the snow to blinding white. When they crested the last hill, 5 children stood in the cabin doorway. Clara broke from the group and ran through the snow and wrapped herself around Silas's leg before he could dismount. Sam stood straight with wet eyes, his jaw locked, saying nothing because some things were too big for any mouth, stuttering or otherwise. Joe stood apart as he always did. But when Silas looked at him, the boy gave a single nod. Slow, weighted. The nod of someone who had watched a man almost run, and then watched him come back and was deciding what that meant. Hannah looked at Silas, looked at Ilara standing beside him, and smiled. Small, thin as paper, but real. Then Tom's voice came from his saddle. "Silas, look, south. Dust rising from the trail, more riders coming. But this time on the lead rider's chest, catching the morning sun like a signal fire, was a silver star." United States Marshal James Whitcomb was not a hero. He was just a man who answered his mail 6 months late. He was 50 years old with a face like chiseled granite, and the bearing of someone who had walked into worse situations and walked out again. He traveled with 2 deputies, and all 3 of them looked like they had been riding hard for days, because they had. Tom's telegraph from Casper had reached the Denver office at the same time as Pope's latest letter, and the combination of decoded journal evidence and a direct plea from a Union veteran had landed on a desk that mattered. Whitcomb dismounted outside the cabin, surveyed the scene, Crane in irons, Cross without his badge, a cabin full of children, and said one sentence. "Well, this is a mess." He was not wrong. The hearing happened at the kitchen table because that was the only table. Whitcomb sat on one side, Silas sat on the other. The children stood or sat wherever they could fit. Tom stood by the door. Ilara leaned against the wall. Whitcomb interviewed each child. He had the kind of directness that children responded to because it did not condescend, and it did not lie. He asked short questions and listened to the answers with his whole body. Sam went first. "I want to stay." The stutter grabbed the word but did not stop it. Joe placed his mother's bone-handled knife on the table, looked at Whitcomb, looked at Silas, picked the knife back up. That was his testimony. Clara set Rosie on the floor, gently, with care. Then she stood up straight and spoke in her own voice. No doll, no shield, no buffer between herself and the world. "This is my home." 3 words. Enough. Hannah folded her arms. "If you split us up, I will find my way back. Every time, until you get tired before I do." Whitcomb almost smiled. Almost. Nettie did not speak. She crawled across the floor, climbed into Silas's lap, and stayed there. She pressed her face against his shirt, and her small fingers curled into the fabric. It was the most eloquent testimony anyone gave that day. Maggie Holloway arrived an hour later carrying a satchel. Inside the satchel were her late husband's financial records. 8 years of transactions. Names, dates, dollar amounts. The entire architecture of the trafficking operation, rendered in careful columns by a man who was dead and a woman who wished she had been braver. She set the satchel on the table. I owe 17 children. This is how I start paying. Whitcomb examined the records. His face changed. You understand this means you will face charges as well. Maggie did not hesitate. I know. Hannah watched Maggie from across the room. The woman who had given her candy at the store. The woman who had been kind. The woman who had also been part of the machine that sold children. And Hannah understood something that most adults spent their whole lives refusing to learn. Kindness and guilt could live inside the same person. Goodness and sin could share the same pair of hands. People were not one thing. They never had been. Cross turned himself in without being asked. He walked to Whitcomb, hands visible, no badge, no weapon. He spoke plainly. I obstructed territorial law enforcement on behalf of Victor Crane for 3 years. I am prepared to give a full accounting. Whitcomb looked at him. You understand. You will be held in the territorial lockup pending trial. I understand. He did not ask for mercy. He held out his wrists to the deputy and walked to the wagon where Crane already sat in chains, and the 2 men who had served the same corrupt master looked at each other and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Spring came the way it always did in Wyoming, sudden and fierce. The snow melted. Creeks swelled. The valley turned green so fast it hurt your eyes. 3 telegraphs arrived in the weeks that followed. Stark arrested in Casper on 17 counts of corruption and conspiracy, to be tried before the territorial court. The Black Rock mine raided. 14 children brought out of the dark, most of them squinting in sunlight they had not seen in months. And Margaret Holloway departed Elk Creek on a one-way stage ticket to Casper, where she would face the county magistrate and whatever justice looked like for a woman who had kept silent too long. Cross drew 6 months in the territorial jail in Laramie, reduced for cooperation and testimony. Maggie was fined and placed on supervised probation by the county court. No imprisonment on account of her voluntary testimony and the financial records that had broken the case wide open. Crane was held in the Casper lockup awaiting trial on trafficking charges, the territorial prosecutor building a case that would take months and fill courtrooms. No one escaped free. Every person paid a price. And that was what made the ending real. The cabin grew. Tom helped Silas add 2 rooms, one for the girls and one for the boys. Sam hauled lumber and drove nails with hands that never shook, even when his voice did. Joe mapped the property and built a fence for the livestock with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that land meant safety and fences meant belonging. Hannah organized everything from meals to supply lists to firewood schedules, because a lifetime of mothering had given her skills that most adults did not have. Clara decorated. She hung dried wildflowers in every window and put Rosie on a shelf where the doll could watch over the whole room. Guardian duty, Clara explained. Rosie watches when everyone else is sleeping. Nettie healed slowly. She did not speak. But she followed Silas everywhere, a silent shadow with gray eyes and a hand that reached for his whenever he stood still long enough. Doc Harlan from Elk Creek rode out and examined her and said what Ilara had already known. Physically, she is sound. The silence is grief. It will break when she is ready. Could be months, could be years. Do not push it. Nobody pushed it. On a morning in late April, Ilara rode to the cabin. Not for a medical visit. She carried her instrument bag as always. But strapped behind the saddle was a suitcase. Silas saw the suitcase from the porch, looked at her. You are moving in? I am moving close. Tom is renting me his spare room. Silas considered this. How close is that? 1/2 mile. That is close. You complaining? No. I am trying to figure out how to say that half a mile is still too far. Elara looked at him. He looked at her. The morning sun was warm on the porch, and the mountains stood white and blue against a sky so clean it looked new. The first kiss happened there, on the porch, in the light, with the sound of children's voices drifting from inside the cabin. It was brief. It was gentle, and it was enough. Daniel's ring caught the sunlight on its chain. Silas saw it, did not ask her to take it off. He had Catherine. She had Daniel. They were not replacing anyone. They were building something new with scarred hands and open eyes, and the old loves stayed where they were, honored and remembered and woven into the fabric of everything that came next. From inside the cabin, Clara's voice rang out at full volume. Sam. Rosie says Papa kissed the doctor. Sam's voice followed, mortified. Clara! Shut up. Silas and Elara looked at each other and laughed. It was the first time either of them had laughed in a very long time, and the sound of it carried across the valley like something being set free. That evening, Silas stood before the two graves behind the cabin. Catherine's cross. Lily's cross. The wood was weathered and soft, and wildflowers had begun to push through the thawed earth at their bases. He had tended these graves every Sunday for 6 years. He had talked to these crosses when there was no one else to talk to. He had poured whiskey on the ground beside them and drunk whiskey standing over them. And once, on the worst night of his life, he had lain down in the snow between them and waited for the cold to take him. It had not taken him. And now he knew why. He did not speak to the graves, not today. Today he just stood there and let the evening settle around him like a blanket. Then he heard small footsteps in the grass behind him. Nettie walked up beside him. Nobody led her. Nobody carried her. She had walked out of the cabin on her own 2 feet and crossed the yard and come to stand beside the man who had carried her out of a frozen wagon on the worst night of the worst winter in Wyoming history. She stood there for a long time. The sky turned copper and gold over the mountains. The first stars appeared. Then, quietly, clearly, in a voice that had been silent for months and was small and rough from disuse but as certain as sunrise, Nettie spoke. Papa. One word. The first word she had spoken to Silas. Not Mama. Not a name from the past. A name for now. For this man, this family, this home. Silas did not turn around. Tears fell down his face, but his voice held steady, steady as stone, steady as the ground beneath his boots, steady as the 6 years of grief that had broken him and the 6 months of love that had put him back together. I hear you, sweetheart. Nettie placed her small hand on Catherine's cross, then on Lily's. Then she reached up and took Silas's hand. 3 of them standing there. 1 man, 2 graves, and a 4-year-old girl who had decided that the world deserved her voice again and gave its first word to the person who had earned it. On the windowsill inside the cabin, Lily's shoes sat where they had sat for 6 years, small and leather and coated in dust. But they were not alone anymore. Beside them, lined up in a row, were 5 more pairs. Hannah's worn boots, Sam's scuffed leather shoes, Joe's moccasins, Clara's small buckled pair, and Nettie's, tiny, set right next to Lily's, close enough to touch. Nobody had arranged them. Nobody had announced it. The shoes had simply appeared there, 1 pair at a time, over the weeks and months, placed by children who were learning what it meant to belong somewhere, to have a sill to set your shoes on, to have a home. From the cabin came the sound of Clara laughing, Sam arguing with Joe over a card game, Hannah calling everyone to supper, Elara's voice answering something that made Tom laugh so hard the windows shook, and under it all, woven through every sound like a thread through cloth, the smell of roasting corn drifting through the open door. Hannah was cooking, and for the first time in 6 years, Silas Mallister's cabin smelled like a home. He held his daughter's hand, stepped past the 2 old graves, and walked toward the light. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and tell me which moment stayed with you the longest. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And share it with someone who needs to hear that family is not built from blood or law or paper. It is built from the simple, stubborn, terrifying decision to love someone and never stop. Because that is what Silas Mallister did. He stopped his horse on a frozen trail when every part of him wanted to ride on. He picked up a child he did not know, and he chose to stay. The story asks one question from the first word to the last. What is a child worth? Victor Crane wrote the answer in dollars. The world wrote it in silence. And one broken cowboy in the Wyoming mountains wrote it the only way that mattered, with everything he had.